Welcome aboard. Welcome to the tour today. Today we are in San Antonio at the San Antonio International Airport. San Antonio was one of the stops United States President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, simply known as JFK, visited in his tragic 1963 trip to Texas. Today we are going to be talking about the final days of JFK and finding some of the locations associated with the 1963 presidential visit and tragic assassination. Let me get the aircraft started and the cockpit set up, and we will be underway. Today we are in the Cessna 208 Grand Caravan. The 208 is a single-engine turboprop aircraft typically configured for 9 passengers. The aircraft is started. Let's take a look around the airport. The San Antonio International Airport has the airport code KSAT and is about 8 miles, 12.8 kilometers north of downtown. It has 3 runways and covers 2,305 acres. It's at an elevation of 809 feet, 247 meters above sea level. While we taxi, let's take a look at today's flight plan. President's flight in 1963 left Andrews Air Force Base in Washington and then went to San Antonio, which is where we are starting from today. Then his trip took him to Houston, to Fort Worth, and then on to Dallas, which will be our final destination today. With an eye on the 1964 election, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, departed Washington, D.C. on Air Force One for a 2-day, 5-city tour of Texas, accompanied by the First Lady Jacqueline "Jackie" Kennedy Onassis. The first stop was here in San Antonio. From San Antonio, they went to a stop in Houston, followed by a stop in Fort Worth, and finally arriving in Dallas. Today we'll be talking about each of these stops, but let's get the aircraft in the air. If this is your first Dude Tour, welcome. What we do is we find places with interesting stories, and then we find them here in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Today we are talking about the President's final hours, John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963. We are at the hold short line. We will be in the air shortly. President Kennedy felt that Texas was crucial to his re-election in 1964, but uncertain with feuding Democratic Party leaders in Texas. The trip was meant to bring party leaders together and reinforce JFK's political themes of education, national security, and world peace. President Kennedy's upcoming trip to Dallas had been first announced to the public in September of 1963. The exact motorcade route was finalized on November 18th and was announced to the public just a few days before November 22nd. A month before Kennedy's ill-fated trip, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was jeered, shoved, and spit on when he visited Dallas. Dallas police were fearful that a similar demonstration would occur when President Kennedy visited Dallas. Several people, including Stevenson, warned Kennedy about coming to Dallas, but Kennedy ignored their advice. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry increased the level of security during Kennedy's visit. He put into effect the most stringent security precautions in the city's history. The itinerary for the trip was Thursday, November 21st, San Antonio, a dedication speech for the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base. A flight to Houston. In Houston, a dinner at the Sam Houston Coliseum honoring Congressman Albert Thomas. The presidential party would then make an impromptu visit at the League of United Latin American Citizens dinner at the Rice Hotel. Following that, a flight to Fort Worth, where they would arrive at the Hotel Texas. Friday, November 22nd, Fort Worth, the Chamber of Commerce breakfast speech at the Hotel Texas, and then a short flight to Dallas. In Dallas, there'd be a luncheon speech attended by the Dallas Citizens Council and the Dallas Assembly at the Trade Mart. From the Trade Mart, they would take a flight to Austin, and in Austin there would be a fundraising dinner and a speech at the Municipal Auditorium. And then, after that, the presidential party was going to Johnson City for a weekend of relaxation at Lyndon Johnson's ranch. On the morning of Thursday, November 21st, 1963, President Kennedy arrived in San Antonio at the San Antonio International Airport. This was the first stop of the 5-city tour of Texas. The president and Mrs. Kennedy were aboard Air Force One, which is the official air traffic control call sign for any United States Air Force aircraft carrying the President of the United States. In October 1962, this latest presidential aircraft was finished, and it was a modified long-range Boeing VC-137C Stratoliner, designated as SAM 26000, SAM for Special Air Missions, and it immediately became an icon of the Kennedy administration. This aircraft, SAM 26000, was in service from 1962 to 1998, serving Presidents Kennedy through Clinton. The president and his motorcade left the airport and headed to downtown San Antonio, where they were greeted by thousands of spectators. The president then headed to Brooks Air Force Base, now just Brooks City Base, arriving at 2:25 p.m. At the base, he gave a dedication speech for the Aerospace Medical Center. He spoke about the importance of space and stated, "This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it." After the speech, the president and his entourage then made their way to Kelly Air Force Base, where Air Force One departed to Houston, Texas. We are approaching downtown San Antonio, Texas, some of the first stops the president made in 1963. Thursday afternoon, November 21st, thousands gathered at Houston International Airport, now Hobby Airport, waiting for the arrival of President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. After their arrival, President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy drove down Broadway in their motorcade towards the Rice Hotel, which is downtown Houston. Although the Kennedys checked into the Rice Hotel, they didn't stay there. This would just be a rest stop before President Kennedy's appearance at Congressman Elmer Thomas's dinner. At the hotel, the Kennedys also dropped in at the League of United Latin American Citizens reception in the grand ballroom of the hotel. Although their appearance was quick, Mrs. Kennedy did have an opportunity to speak in Spanish to the crowd of 700 guests. After this stop, the Kennedys left the Rice Hotel and headed towards the Coliseum to attend the dinner. After the dinner and a 15-minute speech, the Kennedys headed back to the Houston International Airport and departed to Fort Worth. We are approaching one of the first stops the president made. It's Brooks Air Force Base. It was a United States Air Force facility located here in San Antonio, Texas. The last military unit was the 311th Air Base Group, which was inactivated on September 1st of 2011. Thursday, November 21st, at 11:07 p.m., Air Force One lands at Carswell Air Force Base on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas. Air Force Two also lands at Carswell with Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and Texas Governor John Connally, as well as Senator Ralph Yarborough. This second aircraft is making the trip with the Vice President and his staff. It will also fly in and out of all of the same airfields and airports as Air Force One. 11:35 p.m., President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy arrive at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth after being cheered by thousands of well-wishers lined on the route towards the West Freeway. Despite the late time and rainy weather, the President and Mrs. Kennedy take some time to shake hands with people gathered outside the hotel before retiring to their assigned suite, room 850, for the night. Lee Harvey Oswald was a U.S. Marine veteran who had once defected to the Soviet Union. In 1962, Lee and his new Russian wife Marina were allowed to immigrate to the United States, and they settled in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where Lee's mother and brother lived. At the time of the Kennedys' trip, Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina were not living together. Lee Oswald lived in a boarding house on Beckley Avenue in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, and Marina Oswald was living in Irving. Unlike most weeks, Lee showed up on Thursday evening instead of Friday evening when he normally visited her. 6:30 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald got out of bed and gets ready for work. Before he leaves the house, he takes off his wedding ring and leaves it in a cup on top of Marina's dresser. He takes $170 out of his wallet and leaves it with his wedding ring. He had just been hired for a seasonal job at the Texas School Book Depository as a $1.25 an hour clerk filling customer orders for books. That morning, he gets a ride to work at the Texas School Book Depository from a coworker. He's carrying something long, and it's wrapped, and he tells his coworker that it's curtain rods for his room at the boarding house. The morning of the 22nd started out cold and rainy, but as the weather cleared up, President Kennedy instructed his security detail to take the bubble top off the limousine. It wasn't bulletproof, it was just a plastic bubble, but many believed it would make any attempt to shoot the president less likely to succeed. Thousands of people waited in the parking lot of the Hotel Texas in anticipation of the speaking appearance by the president. We are approaching Kelly Field, formerly Kelly Air Force Base, airport code KSKF, and it is a joint-use facility located here in San Antonio, Texas, and it was also one of the stops that President Kennedy made. In 2001, the former Kelly Air Force Base runway and the land west of the runway became Kelly Field, and control was transferred to the adjacent Lackland Air Force Base. 7 a.m., President Kennedy is at the Hotel Texas getting ready for his day. He will give a speech outside the hotel, then give a speech at the Chamber of Commerce inside. Then he will leave Fort Worth for Dallas. President Kennedy had just picked up the Dallas Morning News, and he sees the infamous Black Border ad which accuses him of treason. The full-page John Birch Society hate ad with its ominous black border had caused a premonition of his own death. President Kennedy had said to his wife Jacqueline, or Jackie as she was known, "We're heading into nut country today." 7:30 a.m. in Suite 850, the president dresses in a 2-button blue-gray suit, white shirt, and dark blue tie, and he has breakfast in the hotel room. 8:45 a.m., wearing no protection against the weather, Kennedy speaks to a crowd of thousands standing on a platform set up outside the Hotel Texas. The crowd yells, "Where's Jackie?" The president responds, "There are no faint hearts in Fort Worth, and I appreciate your being here this morning. Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself. It takes a bit longer, but of course, she looks better than we do when she does." 9:10 a.m., President Kennedy takes his place at the hotel's grand ballroom for the scheduled speech, Mrs. Kennedy arriving amid loud applause 15 minutes later. After the speech, Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service agent in charge of the trip, is advised that the presidential limousine should have its bubble top off since it's no longer raining in Dallas. 10 a.m., as the weather continues to clear up, Secret Service agent Wynne Lawson has decided to agree to the president's request to take the bubble top off the presidential limousine. 10:30 a.m., President Kennedy returns to his suite in the Hotel Texas and prepares to leave for Dallas. He remarks to Jackie, "You know, last night would have been a hell of a night to assassinate a president," speaking about their late-night motorcade through Fort Worth. 11 a.m., JFK's motorcade leaves the Hotel Texas to drive to Carswell Air Force Base. 11:10, presidential party arrives at Carswell for the 13-minute, 30-mile flight to Dallas, and at 11:24, Air Force One leaves Fort Worth. 11:37 a.m., Air Force One arrives at Love Field in Dallas with the President and Mrs. Kennedy, Governor John Connally Jr. of Texas and his wife aboard. Vice President Lyndon Johnson and his wife arrive aboard Air Force Two. 11:50, multiple co-workers see Lee Oswald on the first floor of the book depository eating lunch. 11:55 a.m., thousands of supporters and a few protesters line the gate around Love Field. The President and Mrs. Kennedy shake hands with the crowd before the motorcade leaves Love Field 25 minutes later. It's a 9.5-mile journey to the Dallas Trade Mart from the airport, where President Kennedy was to speak at about 12:30 p.m. The motorcade was to leave Love Field on Lemon Avenue, then follow Cedar Springs Road to Harwood Street into downtown Dallas. The motorcade would then turn onto Main Street from Harwood before arriving in Dealy Plaza and then taking a right onto Houston Street, a left onto Elm to reach the access road to the Stemmons Freeway. 12:05 p.m., Kennedy makes his first of many stops to shake hands with groups of people waiting to meet him. This delays the motorcade by 5 minutes. The motorcade finally departs Love Field and follows the intended route. 12:29 p.m., the motorcade turns from Main Street onto Houston Street. The presidential motorcade at this time is traveling about 11 miles per hour. The president's limo then turns onto Elm Street, and it's at this time the first shot is fired, missing the president. Witnesses later will recall hearing 3 shots. Shortly after Kennedy began waving, a few witnesses recognized the first gunshot for what it was. But there was little reaction from most of the crowd or those riding in the motorcade. Many later said they imagined what they heard to be a firecracker or a vehicle backfiring. On the other hand, Governor Connally, like Kennedy, was a World War II military veteran and a longtime hunter. He testified later that he immediately recognized the sound as that of a high-powered rifle, and he turned his head and torso rightward to see Kennedy behind him. He testified he could not see Kennedy, so he then started to turn forward again. He was planning to turn from his right to his left, and when his head was about 20 degrees left to center, he was hit in the upper right back by a bullet that he said he did not hear fired. Mrs. Connolly testified that just after hearing a loud, frightening noise that came from somewhere behind her and to her right, she turned towards President Kennedy and saw him raise his arms and elbows up with his hands in front of his face and throat. She then heard a second shot and then heard her husband, Governor Connolly, yelling. Mrs. Connolly then turned away from Kennedy towards her husband, at which point another gunshot sounded, and she said both her and the interior of the limousine were covered with blood and skull fragments. Secret Service Special Agent Clint Hill was riding on the left front running board of the follow-up car, which was immediately behind Kennedy's limousine. Agent Hill testified that he heard one shot, then he jumped off onto Elm Street and ran forward to try to board the trunk of the limousine and protect Kennedy. Hill heard the fatal headshot as he was about to reach the limousine, approximately 5 seconds after the first shot that he heard. After Kennedy was shot in the head, Mrs. Kennedy began to climb out onto the back of the limousine. Though she later had no recollection of doing so, Agent Hill believed that she was reaching for something, perhaps a piece of President Kennedy's skull. He jumped onto the back of the limousine, while at the same time Mrs. Kennedy returned to her seat, and he clung to the car as it exited Dealy Plaza and accelerated, speeding towards Parkland Memorial Hospital. After Mrs. Kennedy crawled back into the limousine seat, both Governor and Mrs. Connolly heard her repeatedly say, "They've killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." Following the shots, Sheriff Bill Decker ordered Dallas police officers to the railroad tracks behind the fence on the grassy knoll, where some witnesses had claimed to see the gunshots come from. Back at Love Field, Colonel James Swindle, the pilot of Air Force One, was sitting in the communications shack behind the cockpit. He was half listening to the radio turned to Charlie frequency, which was the chatter of the Secret Service agents narrating the progress of President Kennedy's motorcade through Dallas. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hanson, had left the plane during the short stop at Love Field. He made a quick visit to his ailing mother-in-law. As Colonel Swindle waited, he brought on only a light load of fuel for the afternoon's scheduled flight to Austin. All was quiet on Air Force One. Only in Air Force One's single bedroom was there activity. George Thompson, President Kennedy's valet, was laying out a fresh set of clothes for the president to change into when he returns. Back in the communication shack, Colonel Swindle hears the first in a series of puzzling radio calls. The Secret Service agents refer to one another by code names, all starting with D. "Dusty to daylight," the radio crackled. "Have Dagger cover volunteer." Dagger, Swindle knows, is an agent named Rufus Youngblood. Volunteer is the code name for Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. The radio then suddenly dropped out. Colonel Swindle had worried that President Kennedy's notorious bad back had caused an issue, and the motorcade had to stop on its way to the Dallas Trade Mart. 12:33 p.m., the motorcade races towards Parkland Memorial Hospital, which had been notified of the president's injuries. At about the same time, in the book depository building, Lee Oswald leaves his rifle on the 6th floor. He then gets a Coca-Cola from the soda machine and he starts walking out of the building. Officer Marion Baker, a 10-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department, had heard the shots. He looked up to see pigeons flying off the top of the Texas Book Depository, and he sped his motorcycle in that direction. Inside the warehouse, he noticed a man in a light-colored jacket, and he stopped him. The man began to approach, but when Officer Baker asked the building's superintendent, Ron Truly, whether he knew him, Truly affirmed that the jacketed man was an employee, so Baker let Lee Oswald go. Lee Oswald then walked by NBC's Robert McNeil, who was looking for a phone to call in the shooting. Oswald traveled on foot to a nearby Greyhound bus station on Lamar Street. He attempted to take a bus, but the buses were not moving due to all the traffic caused by the shooting in Dealy Plaza. So he catches a cab to the Oak Cliff neighborhood where he lives. 12:35 p.m., the presidential limo arrives at Parkland Memorial Hospital, where patient 24740, white male, suffering from a gunshot wound, is admitted and brought to Trauma Room 1. Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, who is in charge of Dallas, calls the head of the Secret Service, Jerry Ben, to report that President Kennedy has indeed been shot. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, one of the first to enter the room, notes there is a large wound on the back of the president's head as well as a small hole in his throat. At Love Field, on the tarmac, radio operator John Trimble is stretching his legs when a member of the White House Communications Agency, listening to the same Secret Service feed on his portable radio, waves him over. He tells John Trimble that someone in the presidential motorcade has been hurt. The plane needs to be readied for takeoff immediately. My first reaction was that one of the Secret Service agents had fallen from the car, John Trimble would later say. He runs up the ramp onto the plane. Following behind him were the crews from the two nearby passenger jets, Air Force Two, the Vice President's plane, and the Pan American charter for the accompanying press. They had been all grabbing lunch inside the terminal when they were interrupted by a PA announcement. Colonel Swindle asks John Trimble to radio the White House switchboard to find out what's happened, and he also needs a destination. In the meantime, he heads for the stateroom and turns on the TV. A vague early bulletin hits the screen. President Kennedy has been shot. The pilot is soon joined by George Thomas, the presidential valet, Sergeant Joseph Ayres, the plane's steward, and the two secretaries. George, the valet, then returns to the bedroom and begins putting away the clothes he had just laid out for the president. The White House confirms to John Trimble the terrible news: the president has been shot. 12:40 p.m., Walter Cronkite breaks into the CBS television show As the World Turns to announce that the president has been shot. 12:45 p.m., the police broadcast a description of the suspect. The suspect from Elm Street and Houston Street is reported to be an unknown white male, about 30, slender build, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 165 pounds, armed with what is thought to be a .30-30 rifle. We are approaching the airport here in Houston. It is now known as the William P. Hobby Airport, where the president arrived. It has the airport code KHOU, and it is an international airport here in Houston, Texas, located 7 miles or 11 kilometers from downtown Houston. 12:45 p.m., Lee Oswald gets out of the cab, driven by William H. Whaley, which he took back to his boarding house, where he changes his clothes and gets his pistol. 12:50 p.m., General Godfrey McHugh, President Kennedy's top military aide, calls Air Force One from Parkland Hospital. They will be leaving for Andrews Air Force Base, and they will be leaving soon. John Trimble radios Andrews and asks that a voice frequency be kept clear of traffic. He didn't want to say why, since he didn't know how far the news had made it, and he didn't want to be the bearer of it. But Andrews complies with this very unusual request immediately. "Roger, sir, the frequency has been cleared," because the operator at the other end already knows why. Colonel Swindle orders the fuel tanks topped off. He also disconnects Lovefield's mobile air conditioning unit from the plane. The temperature inside starts to rise. Swindle idles only one engine, trying to conserve fuel and providing just enough power to keep on some lights and the TV. Lieutenant Colonel Hanson, the co-pilot, rushes back into the cockpit. His mother-in-law, who was watching TV, yelled to him the news as soon as he had walked through the door. Colonel Swindle plots a flight plan east to Andrews Air Force Base. The two men wait and are unaware of exactly what's unfolding at the hospital only a few miles away. We are making our way now to downtown Houston, Texas, where we will talk about a couple of locations where the president stopped in 1963. 12:57 p.m., Father Oscar Huber arrives at the hospital. President Kennedy's aide, Ken O'Donnell, tells Secret Service agent Clint Hill to order a casket from somewhere nearby. The president is already dead, but Jackie is worried about him receiving his Catholic last rites before he has died. Just after Huber performs them, Dr. Kemp Clark pronounces Kennedy dead. Admiral Dr. George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, officially announces Kennedy's death. Texas Governor John Connally had been struck during the shooting as well. Kennedy and Connally had both entered the Parkland Emergency Department at the same time, but the focus was on the president. Connally was unattended for several minutes, gasping for air with a collapsed lung, until a resident inadvertently walked into the room and saw what was going on. He had this big chest wound. Dr. Red Duke would be one of the doctors responsible for saving Connally's life. Some of the medical staff that day, Dr. Robert McClelland, lead surgeon Dr. Malcolm O'Perry, and Dr. Robert Grossman. Grossman would treat Kennedy as well as the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald later. 1 p.m., with the crowd gathering outside of the hospital awaiting news, doctors at Parkland publicly announce President Kennedy is dead. 1:03 p.m., an accounting of all employees at the book depository finds that Lee Oswald is now missing. 1:15, after being told to patrol the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, Officer J.D. Tippett speaks to someone who fits Oswald's description. Shortly after that, police hear a civilian on the police radio saying, "It's a police officer. Someone has shot him." Lee Oswald had shot police officer Tippett dead at the corner of 10th Street and Patton Avenue in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. 1:22 p.m. Upstairs on the 6th floor of the book depository building, police find a sniper's nest, stacked boxes for concealment and for balancing a rifle, an empty soda bottle, and bones from a fried chicken lunch. They also find a Carcano M38 rifle and 3 shell casings. 1:26 p.m., Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson leaves Parkland for Air Force One. As he and Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson are leaving, she sees the flags drop to half-mast at and around the hospital. 1:30 p.m., Lyndon Johnson, trapped somewhere between vice president and president, is hunched down in the back seat of the first car heading towards Air Force One. Jesse Curry, the chief of Dallas police, is behind the wheel. Arriving at Air Force One, Agent Rufus Youngblood and Congressman Homer Thornberry climb out of the back with Johnson. Congressman Albert Thomas, who had waved down the car when it was leaving Parkland Hospital, is in the front seat. He jumps out with Chief Curry. Lady Bird Johnson is in the second car with Congressman Jack Brooks and 3 more members of the Secret Service. Together, they all run up the Eastern Airlines ramp at the rear of this Boeing 707. We are approaching the site that was the Sam Houston Coliseum, where the president stopped in 1963. The Coliseum was an indoor arena located here in Houston, Texas. The arena opened in November of 1937 and had a capacity of 9,200. The president stopped at the Rice Hotel, and it's now just known as the Rice, and it is a historic building on Texas Avenue here in downtown Houston, Texas. It was originally completed in 1913 on the site of the former Capitol building of what was the Republic of Texas, around 1881. Jesse H. Jones built a new 17-story, double-winged hotel in 1913 called the Rice Hotel. Agent Youngblood and the other agents begin running through the cabin, rapidly closing the plane's shades and curtains. There's an unspoken feeling that Air Force One could be attacked at any moment. With the shades closed and the power mostly off, the plane goes eerily dark. Sergeant Ayers, the steward, sees a police car swerving across the runway, its tires screeching and its sirens on. The Secret Service agents come close to opening fire on the speeding car. In the car is Jack Valente, an unofficial aide of Johnson's, Lem Johnson, a Secret Service agent, and Cliff Carter, one of Johnson's advisors, as well as Cecil Stoughton, the White House photographer. 1:36, Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird Johnson spend their first few minutes aboard Air Force One in the bedroom. Lyndon Johnson then appears in the hallway. Everyone in the room jumps to their feet, including the 3 congressmen. Congressman Thomas is the first of them to speak. "We are ready to carry out any orders that you have, Mr. President," solidifying the fact that he is now president. The sound of hammering is now heard in the aircraft. In the small aft cabin behind the bedroom, Sergeant Ayers is removing 2 rows of seats to make room for a casket. 1:38 p.m. On the TV in the stateroom, Walter Cronkite puts on his dark-framed reading glasses. The plane goes pin-drop quiet. From Dallas, Texas, the flash.
The flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
1:40 p.m. Now President Johnson goes into the relative privacy of the bedroom. The next important issue at hand is the oath of office. Johnson takes off his jacket in the rising heat and lies down on one of the beds. He picks up the phone and asks John Trimble to connect him to Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and President Kennedy's brother. They discuss the logistics around Johnson being officially sworn in as president. The new president receives 2 calls from Washington. The first is from McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy's national security advisor. The second is from Walter Jenkins, one of Johnson's most trusted aides. Both men tell him he should return to Washington immediately. Johnson says he will not leave without Jackie Kennedy, and she has let it be known that she will not leave without her husband's body. Johnson does not want to be remembered as abandoning the president's widow. 1:40 p.m., Lee Oswald runs into a movie theater that is playing the film War is Hell, and he is seen sneaking in when the police start to search the theater. The lights are raised, and Officer Nick McDonald spots Oswald in the seats. McDonald walks up to Oswald, who says this is it, and pulls out a revolver. As they fight, Officer McDonald gets his finger in front of the pistol's hammer, so the gun will not fire. Oswald punches the officer in the face, and the officer punches him back, giving Oswald a black eye. 1:43 p.m., Air Force One radios Andrews Air Force Base, stand by for takeoff, although it does not take off. 1:50 p.m., President Johnson calls Irving Goldberg, a lawyer and a friend. They decide to ask U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a longtime friend of Johnson's, to administer the oath of office. Marie Fermer, his secretary, calls Hughes' office. A clerk tells her that the judge is not in. He believes she's at the Trade Mart, where she went to see President Kennedy make his speech. Fermer hangs up and informs Johnson that Hughes can't be found. He tells her to call the office back. This time, he takes the phone himself. "This is Lyndon Johnson," he says. "Find her." 1:50 p.m., police arrest Oswald at the theater. 1:55 p.m., Air Force One continues to fill. Although it normally carries about 25 passengers comfortably, it's now taking on most of Air Force Two's original passengers as well, nearly twice its usual load. Piles of bags, including Johnson's suitcases, are carried from Air Force Two across the runway to Air Force One. 2 p.m., at Parkland Hospital, Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman gets into an argument with the Dallas County medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose. The Kennedy staff want the president's body put in a casket, and they want to leave the hospital with it. At this point, killing a president is not a federal offense, so the local and state authorities have jurisdiction. Because of this, the medical examiner argues that an autopsy has to be performed before the body is taken from Dallas. Johnson orders the body to be released, but the medical examiner refuses. Finally, he is overridden by Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade, who only agrees to release the body if Admiral Dr. Berkeley, Kennedy's private physician, promises to stay with the body until it is put in the casket for the final time. Lee Harvey Oswald arrives at the Dallas Police Department headquarters and is led to the homicide and robbery office on the 3rd floor. We are approaching Fort Worth, Texas. This is the 3rd city that the president visited in 1963 on his tour through Texas. Carswell Air Force Base, one of the airfields used by Air Force One in 1963. It is a former United States Air Force base located northwest of Fort Worth, Texas. For most of its operational lifetime, the base's mission was to train and support heavy strategic bombing groups. Air Force One landed here at Carswell Air Force Base shortly after 11 p.m. on November 21st. The next morning, November 22nd, President Kennedy returned here to Carswell Air Force Base at about 11:25 a.m. and boarded Air Force One for a 15-minute flight to Love Field in Dallas. 2:02 p.m., Judge Hughes has been found and she is on her way. In the passenger cabin, Stoughton, the White House photographer, approaches Lyndon Johnson's aides. "You must go in and tell the president." He says that this is a history-making moment, and while it seems tasteless, I am here to take a picture if he cares to have it, and I think we should have it. 2:04 p.m., although Texas law had mandated an autopsy must be performed, the Secret Service removed the president's casket from Parkland Memorial Hospital. 2:07 p.m., President Kennedy's body leaves Parkland Hospital bound for Love Field. 2:14 p.m., a white hearse pulls up to the ramp at the rear of the aircraft, followed immediately by 2 other cars. Both are packed with Secret Service agents. Among them are Bill Greer, the driver of President Kennedy's open-topped limousine, Roy Kellerman, who had been in the front passenger seat, and Clint Hill, who had sprinted forward to climb onto the back of the car. Joining the crowd behind the hearse is President Kennedy's close network of advisors, Ken O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, and Dave Powers, as well as Dr. George Berkeley, Kennedy's personal physician, and General McHugh and General Ted Clifton, Kennedy's military aides. Together, they remove the president's casket. The men break off the casket's long handles to fit it through the plane's door and settle it into the empty space in the aft cabin where the 2 rows of seats had been removed in preparation for the casket. Jackie Kennedy, who had ridden in the back of the hearse with her husband's body, followed the casket up the steps, appearing in shock, just repeating, "Oh, what if I had not been there?" "I don't know what to say," Lady Bird Johnson told her. "What wounds me most of all is that this should happen in my beloved state of Texas." To this, Jackie said nothing. She sat in silence with her pink outfit stained with gore and fragments of her husband's skull and brain matter. One of her stockings was almost completely hardened in blood. Her right glove, white that morning, is caked and stiff with blood. Her left glove is missing. Lady Bird asked her, "Can I get someone to help you change?" "No," Jackie says, "not right now. I want them to see what they have done to Jack." 2:20 p.m., Ken O'Donnell, a Kennedy advisor, desperate to take off, heads toward the cockpit. He runs into General Godfrey McHugh, President Kennedy's top military aide, and orders the general to get the plane in the air. After the fight at Parkland regarding the removal of the president's body, O'Donnell fears that Air Force One will be refused air clearance or even intercepted by the local police. In the confusion, he's not even aware that the police chief is on the plane. General McHugh has already spoken to Colonel Swindle, who gave him the message that General McHugh now passed along to Ken O'Donnell. President Johnson wants the plane grounded until he's sworn in. 2:28 p.m., Judge Sarah T. Hughes arrives. Mac Kilduff, President Kennedy's assistant press secretary, escorts 3 pool reporters onto the plane behind her. President, rising out of his chair, ready to be sworn in, says, "If there's anybody else aboard who wants to see this, tell them to come in." The room begins to fill with people. 2:34 p.m., Marie Famer, Johnson's secretary, hands the typewritten oath to Judge Hughes. But they still need a Bible. Larry O'Brien, a Kennedy aide, finds a small Catholic prayer book in the bedroom. It's in a small box, still wrapped in cellophane. It was possibly a gift, something somebody somewhere had thrust into Kennedy's hand. Now O'Brien tears open the box and hands the book to Judge Hughes. Johnson says, "Would you ask Mrs. Kennedy to come stand here?" He wanted her to stand beside him. "You can't do that," Ken O'Donnell says. "The poor kid has had enough for one day. To sit here and hear that oath that she heard a few years ago, you just can't do that, Mr. President." "Well," Johnson says, "she said she wanted to do it." Finally, O'Donnell walks into the bedroom. Jackie is combing her hair. "Do you want to go out there?" O'Donnell asked her. "Yes," Jackie says, "I think I ought to. I at least owe that much to the country." 2:37 p.m., Jackie Kennedy comes out of the bedroom. The room falls silent. She has taken off her single bloody glove, but she has not changed her clothes. These are the clothes she's wearing in the photograph of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in as President of the United States. We are approaching the historic Hilton Fort Worth, which was formerly known as the Hotel Texas when the president visited here. This is where President Kennedy spent his final night. The hotel has many of the historical photos up that show that day. 2:38 p.m., 27 observers crowd into the stateroom of Air Force One. It's been 98 minutes since President Kennedy died. Cecil Stoughton, the White House photographer, climbs up on the couch, pressing himself against a wall. "You're going to have to back off just a little bit if I'm going to get you all in," he says to Johnson, and the foursome at the center of the portrait pushes themselves back towards the crowd. Most of them can't hear Judge Hughes over the whine of the engines now roaring to life on Air Force One. Johnson took the oath, adding for good measure 4 words that are not in the oath: "So help me God." He turned to kiss his wife, Lady Bird, who was near tears. She takes Jackie's hand. "The whole nation mourns your husband," she tells Jackie. Johnson now becomes the 36th President of the United States. He is the first president to be sworn in by a woman. Jesse Curry, the chief of the Dallas Police, leans towards Jackie, says, "God bless you, little lady, but you ought to go back and lie down." "No thanks, I'm fine," she says, before she slowly makes her way back to the aft cabin, where she drops down in the seat beside her husband's casket, and that's where she will remain for the rest of the trip. 2:41 p.m., Lyndon Johnson now issues his first official order as president. "Now let's get airborne." Police Chief Curry, Judge Hughes, Sid Davis of Westinghouse Broadcasting, and Stoughton, the photographer with his precious film still in his camera around his neck, all dash off the plane and down the ramp. Air Force One's doors are locked and shut behind them. 2:47 p.m., Colonel Swindle lifts Air Force One into the sky. The reporter, Sid Davis, watching from the tarmac, was shocked by the steepness of the ascent. He later would say it was almost vertical. It's as though Colonel Swindle wanted to leave not only Dallas, but leave Earth. 3 p.m., Oswald's first interrogation is underway. Police had taken tests of his hands and face to determine if he had fired a gun. The test on his hands came back positive. At this point, they have only charged him with the killing of Officer Tippit. He has not been charged with killing the president yet. 3:17 p.m., Air Force One receives a weather report warning of storm clouds ahead. Colonel Swindle begins to climb, and he ascends to an altitude that's higher than he had ever flown with President Kennedy before. He could clearly see the curvature of the Earth, and for the first time it hits him. In a letter to the author of The Death of a President, Swindle describes the moment. As the sun set on the flight from Dallas, flying over the storm clouds at 40,000 feet, and darkness coming on so fast because of our high speed towards the east, suddenly realizing that President Kennedy was dead, I felt that the world had ended, and it became a struggle to continue. 3:23 p.m., some of Kennedy's people have asked Johnson to bar the press from Andrews Air Force Base to make their touchdown as invisible as possible. They don't want to make a spectacle of the bronze casket or the blood-soaked Jackie. "No," Johnson says, "it will look like we're in a panic." Mac Kilduff, President Kennedy's assistant press secretary, whose code name is Warrior, talks over the radio to Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Hatcher, codename Winner, at the White House. Winner, this is Warrior," Kilduff said. "Will you please advise the press that normal press coverage, including live TV, will be allowed at the base?" When Kilduff walks back to tell Jackie of the decision, she seems to approve of it. "I want them to see what they've done," she says. 3:24 p.m., General Clifton calls McGeorge McBundy, the National Security Advisor, at the White House and tells him that Johnson wants to meet with the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, immediately after landing. Johnson has not ruled out a military response to the assassination if the Soviet Union, Cuba, or Vietnam is behind the assassination. A few minutes earlier, Johnson had been told about the unknown man who was also in the room and the contents of his steel briefcase. His name is Ira Gerhardt. His code name is Satchel. His briefcase holds a collection of bulky packets, each bearing wax seals and the signature of all the Joint Chiefs. One contains cryptic numbers that will permit Johnson to talk to the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the President of France in 4 minutes. Another holds the codes to launch a nuclear attack. The rest contain the Doomsday Books, a range of retaliation scenarios, and the estimated number of casualties that would result from each of these. 3:47 p.m., Ken O'Donnell rose to his feet. "You know what I'm going to have, Jackie? I'm going to have a hell of a stiff drink. drink. I think you should have one too." "What will I have?" Jackie asked him. "I'll make you a scotch." She had never had scotch in her life. "Now is as good a time as any to start," she said. 4 p.m. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover calls Robert Kennedy to tell him we have the man. Lee Oswald waits for his first lineup with Helene Markham, the witness to police officer Tippett's murder. While waiting, Oswald is searched and 5 bullet cartridges are found in his pocket. Jack Ruby, who owns the Carousel Club in Dallas, stops by the police station for the first time. Since many of the officers frequent his club, he's familiar with quite a few people, and he's able to walk around the police station freely. As we make a turn here into Dallas, we will be passing over Dealy Plaza. It's a city park here in the West End historic district of downtown Dallas. It's sometimes called the birthplace of Dallas. It's the location where the assassination of John F. Kennedy took place in 1963. The Dealy Plaza Historic District was named a National Historic Landmark on the 30th anniversary of the president's assassination. And of course, here in Dealy Plaza, we have the Texas School Book Depository Building, now known as the Dallas County Administration Building. It is a 7-floor building that faces Dealy Plaza. And of course, it's the building where Lee Harvey Oswald had the vantage point to assassinate the president in November of 1963. The building is also recorded as a Texas Historic Landmark located at 411 Elm Street on the northwest corner of Elm and North Houston Streets. We will now make our way to Parkland Memorial Hospital, which is where the motorcade sped to out of Dealy Plaza after the president had been shot. 4:05 p.m., Colonel Swindle radios ahead to make arrangements for his landing. "We need steps on the right front of the aircraft," he says. "President Johnson will deplane at the front of the aircraft. We need a forklift at the rear of the aircraft. And Lace will depart from the right front, over." Lace was the code name for Jackie. We are passing over the Dallas Market Center. The campus also includes the Trade Mart, which is where President Kennedy was heading to in 1963 to make a speech. It's a 5 million square foot trade center here in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Berkeley has joined the men on their knees in front of Jackie, next to the casket. He tells her they will be landing soon. Maybe she would like to change her clothes, wash away the blood. "No, let them see," she says. No one within earshot needs to hear more. They understand that the ramp at the front of the plane for Jackie will go unused. Jackie will be staying with her husband. 4:22 p.m., Jackie sends an assistant forward with a message. She wants Bill Greer, the agent who drove the presidential limousine, to drive the ambulance already waiting at Andrews Air Force Base to carry the body to Bethesda Naval Medical Center. "I want his friends to carry him down," she says. 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Air Force One arrives at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. Among many others waiting for the plane were Robert Kennedy, Robert McNamara, and General Maxwell Taylor. Jackie Kennedy has requested that the Secret Service agents who carried her husband onto the plane, as well as his friends, carry him off the plane. She repeats her request that Secret Service agent Bill Greer drive the ambulance with the coffin. Robert Kennedy has rushed onto the plane to find Jackie. He puts his arm around her and quietly says, "Hi, Jackie, I'm here." When they get into the ambulance with the casket, Jackie recounts the motorcade and the shooting and the aftermath in detail to Robert. Lyndon Johnson goes on to make his first statement on TV as president. 6:20 p.m. Central Time, Lee Oswald's second interrogation starts. At this point, they're still only investigating and interrogating Oswald about the shooting death of Officer Tippett. As he is taken out for his second lineup, Oswald yells to the press, "I didn't shoot anyone." 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy enter Bethesda Naval Hospital. Robert Kennedy signs the order for the autopsy of his brother. Robert Sargent Shriver, the president's brother-in-law, prepares the White House to receive Kennedy's body and for it to lay in repose. He has covered the building in black bunting, and at the request of Jackie Kennedy, has gathered books and historical documents so he can make the White House look like it did when President Lincoln died and he laid in repose in the White House. 7:10 p.m. Central Time. Captain Fritz has questioned Marina Oswald. He has also signed a complaint charging Oswald with the murder of Officer Tippett. FBI agents have been sitting in on the interrogations. In regards to the president's assassination, Gordon Shanklin, the agent in charge of the Dallas office, states Oswald was probably a good suspect, but they've been unable to develop information connecting him to the rifle. 11 p.m. Eastern Time. After it began at 8:15 p.m., under the charge of Commander J.J. Humes, Kennedy's autopsy is concluded. Dr. Humes later states that the autopsy results were that Kennedy was killed by 2 shots from the rear. At 11:26 p.m. Central Time, Oswald is charged with Kennedy's murder. Parkland Memorial Hospital is the hospital here in Dallas, and it's the main hospital for Parkland Health Hospital System. As we discussed, after the president was shot on November 22, 1963, he was rushed to Parkland. He was treated in Trauma Room 1 30 minutes after he was shot here at Dealy Plaza. At the same time, Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded in the shooting, was treated here in Trauma Room 2, and he survived. 2 days after the assassination, on November 24th, Lee Oswald would be rushed here to Parkland after being shot by Jack Ruby, and he died in operating room number 5. Saturday, November 23, 1963, 1:35 a.m. Central Time. Judge David Johnson rules that Oswald voluntarily and with malice aforethought killed John F. Kennedy by shooting him with a gun. Shortly after, Oswald is officially told that he has been charged with Kennedy's murder. 3:56 a.m. Eastern Time, Kennedy's body is brought to the White House where he will lay in repose until Sunday. On Monday, November 25th, which is his son John Jr.'s 3rd birthday, Kennedy will be laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. That was the timeline and some of the locations for the last few days of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Let's make our way now to Love Field, and we will discuss a little bit more about the events that happened there when we get on the ground, so stay with us. The cost of today's tour is reasonable. If you could just reach down and hit that subscribe button, I appreciate it. It really does help the channel, and if you're already subscribed, thank you. Maybe you could share the channel with someone else you think might enjoy these tours. We are making our way now to Dallas Love Field, our final destination today, and we'll talk a little more once we get on the ground, but let's get the plane landed and we will find a parking spot at Dallas Love Field.
White House situation on this wayside. You read me over? This is forward. This is Crown. This is Crown. Do you want situation room? I want the situation room. That's affirmative. This is the situation room. I read you. Go ahead. Give me all available information on President. Over. All available information on President follows. He and Governor Connally of Texas have been hit in the car in which they were riding. We do not know how serious the situation is. We have no information. That is affirmative. Affirmative. Please keep us advised on here. This plane on which Secretary of State, other cabinet ministers headed for Japan, turning around, returning to Honolulu, will arrive there approximately 2 hours. Over. Wayside, this is the situation room. I read from the AP bulletin, Kennedy apparently shot in head. He fell face down in back seat of his car. Blood was on his head. Mrs. Kennedy cried, "Oh no," and tried to hold up his head. Connally remained half-seated, slumped to the left. There was blood on his face and forehead. The president and the governor were rushed to Parkland Hospital near the Dallas Trade Mart, where Kennedy was to have made a speech. Over. Wayside, roger and out. 26,000, duplex is on, go ahead. Hey, stand by one. We're at the airport. 26,000, everybody aboard. Okay, go ahead. We're waiting for the swearing in at the plane before takeoff. Say again, Roy, say again. We're waiting for Judge to appear for swearing in. That is for volunteer, is that right? Yes, we are having one, getting one here to have it done before we take off, Jury. Air Force One, do you read me in? Yes, command from 26,000, go ahead. Roger, can you give me an estimated time of departure from Dallas, over? Roger, it could be within the next 10 minutes, go ahead. Roger, would you give us a call when you're airborne? Andrews, Air Force One. Air Force One, Andrews, go ahead, sir. Taxi out. Roger, Andrews. Air Force Command Post, Sergeant Phillips, sir. I have Air Force One. Stand by one, please. Roger. Dallas at 2047 to Zulu, and we'll call a couple of minutes. 2+10, and do you have any passengers on board? Roger, full load, 40 plus. And is Mrs. Kennedy on board? Air Force One, Andrews, I have Sam Command Post standing by, sir. Command Post, Air Force One, go ahead. Stand by one, sir. Okay, give Air Force One a call, please. Air Force One, Sam Command Post, go ahead. Roger, this is Colonel Hornbuckler in operations. We have a request from the Chief of Staff's office to know if you have Mr. Johnson and Mr. Kennedy's body aboard. Okay, Air Force One, affirmative on all of those questions, go ahead. Roger, thank you very much. 26,000, Sam Command Post. Sam Command, Air Force One, go ahead, please. Roger, Air Force One. Are you airborne at present? Are you airborne at present? Affirmative, airborne at 2047, 2047. Estimated time on the Fox, Andrews, 2
Welcome to Dallas Love Field. Love Field, the airport code is KDAL. It's a city-owned public airport, 6 miles or 9.7 kilometers northwest of downtown Dallas, Texas. The transfer of power between U.S. presidents happened aboard Air Force One right here on the tarmac. As always, everything we talked about today was my own research and preparation for the tour. If you have any corrections or comments, please leave them in the comments below, and we will see you on the next tour.
AF1, please stand by. We have Mrs. Rose Kennedy. AF1, have you got your party? Go ahead.
Stand by one, please.
Roger. I'm going to put Mrs. Rose Kennedy on the line now. Roger. She's coming on now. AF1 from Crown, Mrs. Kennedy on. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Mrs. Kennedy. Hello, Mrs. Kennedy. We're talking from the airplane. Can you hear us all right? Over.
Hello.
Yes, Mrs. Kennedy. I have Mr. Johnson for you here.
Yes, thank you.
Miss Kennedy?
Yes, Mr. President.
I wish to God there was something that I could do, and I wanted to tell you that we were greeting with you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know you love Jack and he loves you. Miss Kennedy, we feel like we just had a... Yes, all right. We have made a decision and concern for what you did. Well, thank you, Lady Bird. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Love and prayers to all of you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye.